Before we begin, this documentary is made for relaxation and sleep. We invite you to turn off your screen, close your eyes, and let history unfold quietly as the story of the past becomes your path to peace. On the night of December 29, 1916, a group of Russian nobles invited Grigori Rasputin to a palace in St. Petersburg. They fed him cakes and wine, laced with enough cyanide to kill 5 men. He ate them all and asked for more, so they shot him in the chest. He fell, then stood back up and attacked his assassins. They shot him 3 more times. He still wouldn't die, so they beat him with clubs, wrapped his body in a carpet, and threw him into the frozen Neva River. When they pulled his corpse from the ice 3 days later, the autopsy revealed the truth. Grigori Rasputin had drowned, after the poison, after the bullets, after the beating. He was still alive when he hit the water. This is the true story of Rasputin, the mad monk who controlled the Russian Empire, corrupted the royal family, and refused to die. If you're here to uncover the truth behind one of history's most mysterious figures, you've found the right place. Subscribe to The Deep Unknown for more stories that reveal the darkness behind the legends. And if this journey into Imperial Russia's final days captivates you, leave a comment below. I read every single one. A Siberia's Dark Prophet. To understand the man who would bring down an empire, we must travel 1,400 miles east of Moscow, to a place where winter lasts 8 months and the summer sun barely sets. In the village of Pokrovskoye, Siberia, where the Tura River cuts through endless forests of birch and pine, Grigori Yefimovich Rasputin was born on January 21, 1869. His father, Yefim, drove a cart for traveling merchants, hauling goods along muddy roads that turned to ice in winter. The family lived in a wooden house with a single room, sharing their space with whatever animals they owned. This was the Russia of peasants, where life expectancy barely reached 40, and most people never traveled more than 20 miles from where they were born. Grigori was the 4th of 9 children, though only 3 would survive past childhood. Disease, starvation, and the brutal Siberian cold claimed the others. From the beginning, young Grigori was different. The other village children feared him. He was wild, prone to violent outbursts, and by the age of 14, he had already earned a reputation as a thief and a drunk. The villagers whispered that he stole horses, though nothing was ever proven. He fought constantly, his fists bloodied from brawls outside the village tavern. His father beat him regularly, trying to instill discipline, but it only seemed to make the boy more rebellious. Then, at 18, everything changed. Grigori nearly drowned in the Tura River while drunk, and in those moments beneath the icy water, he claimed to see the Virgin Mary. She spoke to him, he said, telling him that he had been chosen for a special purpose. When he was pulled from the water, gasping and shivering, he was no longer the same violent boy. Something in his eyes had changed. They became intense, piercing, impossible to look away from. He began to speak of God and sin and redemption. He abandoned his theft and fighting, though he never stopped drinking. Instead, he joined a religious sect called the Klisti, an outlawed splinter group of the Orthodox Church that believed salvation came through sin. Their rituals involved ecstatic dancing, speaking in tongues, and what they called rejoicing, which was their term for ritual sex. The Klisti taught that one must exhaust sin in order to transcend it. First you sin, then you repent, and through this cycle, you become closer to God. This philosophy would define Rasputin for the rest of his life. He transformed himself into a Stranik, a wandering holy man who traveled from village to village, sleeping in fields and forests, begging for food, offering prayers and blessings to anyone who would listen. For 2 years, he walked across Russia, covering over 2,000 miles on foot, making pilgrimages to holy sites. He reached Mount Athos in Greece, one of Orthodox Christianity's most sacred places, where he spent months in prayer and meditation among the monks. When he returned to Siberia, he had developed a reputation as a starets, an elder with mystical healing powers. People came to him with illnesses and troubles, and he would pray over them, staring into their eyes with that hypnotic gaze that seemed to see into their souls. Sometimes they got better, sometimes they didn't. But everyone who met him remembered those eyes. He never bathed. His hair was long and greasy, his beard tangled and unkempt. His clothes were always dirty, often torn. He smelled of sweat and earth and something else, something animal. But when he spoke, His voice was deep and calm, and when he looked at you, it felt like he was pulling something out of you, some truth you didn't know you were hiding. By 1903, when Rasputin was 34 years old, word of the Siberian mystic had spread beyond the villages. Religious circles in St. Petersburg, Russia's glittering capital, had become fascinated with spiritualism and the occult. The aristocracy held seances in their parlors and invited fortune tellers to their parties. They craved authenticity, something real in their world of fake prophets and charlatan mediums. When Grigori Rasputin arrived in St. Petersburg that year, introduced to aristocratic salons by a priest from Kazan, he was everything they had been looking for. Here was a genuine peasant, straight from the Siberian wilderness, with no education and no refinement, speaking in rough peasant dialect about visions and miracles. He was exotic, dangerous, and most importantly, he seemed real. Two powerful religious figures took notice of him. Bishop Hermogen and a monk named Iliador both proclaimed that Rasputin was a true man of God, blessed with divine gifts. They brought him into churches and monasteries, gave him legitimacy, opened doors for him. The aristocratic women of St. Petersburg began inviting him to their homes, asking for his prayers and his blessings. He would arrive late at night, reeking of alcohol, his clothes filthy, and he would tell them that they were beautiful in the eyes of God. He would hold their hands and stare into their eyes and tell them their sins were forgiven. His philosophy, which he preached openly, was simple and scandalous. You must sin to be forgiven. You cannot know God's grace without first knowing sin. The more you sin, the more you can be redeemed. It was the perfect justification for anything he wanted to do, and the society women of St. Petersburg, bored with their loveless marriages and empty lives, found it intoxicating. But Rasputin wanted more than late-night visits to aristocratic parlors. He wanted power, and in 1905, he would find the key to it. Into the glittering world of imperial Russia walked a filthy peasant who would bring an empire to its knees. The Bleeding Prince. On August 12, 1904, Tsarina Alexandra Feodorovna gave birth to her fifth child, a son named Alexei. After 4 daughters, the Russian Empire finally had a male heir. Church bells rang across the country. Nicholas II, the Tsar of all Russia, wept with joy. The 300-year-old Romanov dynasty had secured its future, but within weeks, the royal physicians noticed something wrong. When the baby developed a small bruise on his leg, it didn't heal. It spread, darkening, swelling. The boy screamed in pain for hours. The doctors were baffled, then horrified, then silent, because they knew what this meant, and they knew there was no cure. Alexei had hemophilia, the bleeding disease that had haunted European royal families for generations. It came through Queen Victoria's bloodline, passed down through her daughters and granddaughters to the princes of Europe. Alexandra herself was a carrier, though she didn't know it until her son was born. The disease meant that Alexei's blood could not clot properly. Any injury, even a minor bump or scrape, could trigger internal bleeding that would not stop. There was no treatment, no medicine, no surgery that could save him. Most hemophiliac boys died before reaching adulthood. The royal family kept the diagnosis secret. Only the inner circle knew. Nicholas and Alexandra became consumed with protecting their son from every possible danger. They hired sailors from the Imperial Navy to carry him so he wouldn't fall. They patted the corners of furniture. They watched him constantly, living in a state of perpetual terror. And still, the bleeding episodes came. When Alexei was injured, the doctors could do nothing but watch as he screamed in agony while blood pooled in his joints and organs. Alexandra would sit by his bedside for days, praying, weeping, desperate. The doctors tried everything: aspirin, tight bandages, bloodletting. None of it worked. In fact, many of their treatments made it worse. Aspirin thins the blood. Tight bandages increased pressure and pain. The doctors, for all their education and their credentials, were helpless. In October 1905, Grand Duchess Milika, a member of the extended royal family and a devotee of mysticism, told Alexandra about a holy man from Siberia who had miraculous healing powers. His name was Grigori Rasputin. Alexandra, desperate and exhausted, agreed to meet him. The first meeting took place in the royal palace. Alexandra brought Rasputin to her son's room, where the boy lay in bed, pale and weak from a recent bleeding episode. The doctors had given up, They said there was nothing more they could do. Alexandra begged Rasputin to pray for her son. Rasputin stood over the bed and looked down at Alexei with those piercing eyes. He placed his hand on the boy's forehead. Then he began to pray, not in the formal language of the Orthodox Church, but in his rough peasant dialect, speaking to God as if God were his personal friend. He prayed for 20 minutes, his voice low and rhythmic, almost hypnotic. Then he told Alexandra that the boy would be fine, that God had heard her prayers, and he left. Within hours, Alexei's pain began to subside. By the next morning, he was sitting up. The swelling decreased. The crisis passed. The doctors had no explanation. Alexandra had no doubt. God had sent this holy man to save her son. Modern medical experts have theories about what actually happened. Rasputin's calm, confident presence likely reduced Alexandra's stress, which in turn reduced Alexei's stress. Stress causes blood pressure to rise and can worsen bleeding in hemophilia patients. More importantly, Rasputin probably told Alexandra to stop letting the doctors treat the boy. No more aspirin, no more tight bandages, no more interventions that made things worse. Just rest and calm and prayer. And it worked. But Alexandra didn't care about medical theories. She knew what she had witnessed. This peasant from Siberia could do what all the trained physicians of Europe could not. He could save her son, and because of that, she would give him anything he wanted. Nicholas II wrote in his diary on November 1st, 1905, "We have made the acquaintance of a man of God, Grigori from the Tobolsk province. His words were measured, cautious." Nicholas was always suspicious of mystics and holy men. But Alexandra had no such doubts. She began inviting Rasputin to the palace regularly, giving him access to the royal family's private apartments, allowing him to visit without appointments or escorts. He became, in her mind, not just a healer, but a prophet, someone chosen by God specifically to protect her son. The pattern repeated itself over the next several years. Alexei would suffer a bleeding episode. The doctors would try their treatments and fail. Alexandra would send for Rasputin. He would pray, sometimes in person, sometimes from hundreds of miles away via telegram. And Alexei would improve, every single time. The most dramatic incident occurred in October 1912, when the family was vacationing at their hunting lodge in Spala, Poland. Alexei, then 8 years old, was riding in a carriage when it hit a bump. The jolt caused severe internal bleeding in his abdomen and groin. For 11 days, the boy screamed in agony. His stomach swelled grotesquely, his temperature spiked. The doctors prepared Alexandra for the worst. Bulletins were issued to the public, preparing the nation for the death of the heir to the throne. Alexandra sent a telegram to Rasputin, who was back home in Siberia at the time. His response came quickly. "The little one will not die. Do not allow the doctors to bother him too much." Alexandra immediately ordered the doctors to stop their treatments. They were furious, but they had no choice. She was the Tsarina. Within 24 hours, Alexei's fever broke. The swelling began to decrease. Within a week, he was out of danger. Within a month, he was walking again. To Alexandra, this was proof not just of Rasputin's power, but of God's will. "He alone can save Alexei," she wrote to Nicholas. "Without him, our son will die." This belief, this absolute conviction, would shape the next 4 years of Russian history, because Rasputin now understood something crucial. As long as he could keep the boy alive, Alexandra would do anything he asked, and through Alexandra, he could control the Tsar. Saving the prince was only the beginning. Rasputin wanted power, and he would use the Tsarina to get it. The holy devil, Grigori Rasputin, lived 2 lives simultaneously, and he made no effort to hide either one. By day, he was our friend, as Alexandra called him, the holy man who prayed over the heir to the throne and advised the royal family on spiritual matters. By night, he was something else entirely, a drunken lecher who prowled the bathhouses and restaurants of St. Petersburg, groping women in public and preaching his doctrine of salvation through sin. The bathhouses were his favorite haunts. In Russia, public baths were social gathering places where men and women bathed separately, but Rasputin somehow gained access to both sections. Witnesses reported seeing him walk naked through the women's baths, touching them, blessing them, telling them that physical contact with him brought them closer to God. Some women screamed and ran. Others stayed. Some even sought him out, believing his teachings that sexual union with a holy man was a form of prayer. His justification was always the same: you must sin to be forgiven. How can you know God's grace if you have never known temptation? I sin for you, he would say. I take your sins into my body so that you can be pure. It was the Klisti doctrine taken to its extreme, twisted into a rationalization for whatever he wanted to do. The restaurants and taverns knew him well. He would arrive late at night, already drunk, shouting and laughing, surrounded by women. He would grab waitresses, pull them onto his lap, put his hands up their skirts while other diners watched in shock. One police report described him groping a woman's genitals in full view of a crowded restaurant, while shouting that he could do whatever he wanted because he was protected by the Tsarina. Aristocratic women flocked to him despite his behavior, or perhaps because of it. In the suffocating propriety of imperial Russian high society, Rasputin represented something forbidden and dangerous. He was crude, unwashed, overtly sexual, everything their refined world rejected. And he told them they were beautiful, that their bodies were sacred, that pleasure was holy. For women trapped in loveless arranged marriages, it was intoxicating. One of his devotees, Maria Golovina, the daughter of a prominent aristocrat, later testified about his hypnotic power. When he looked at you, she said, you felt paralyzed. You couldn't resist. It wasn't desire exactly, though there was that too. It was something deeper, a sense that he could see every secret you ever kept, every dark thought you ever had, and that he accepted all of it. His eyes pulled you in and wouldn't let go. Rasputin's apartment on Gorokhovaya Street became infamous. Neighbors complained about the constant stream of female visitors at all hours. The building's courtyard was full of peasant women waiting to see him, hoping for his blessing or his healing prayers. Inside, the apartment was chaos. Women came and went. He drank constantly. He received visitors while lying in bed, often with women beside him. His daughter Maria, who lived with him, later wrote that she became numb to seeing her father in bed with multiple women, that it was simply how he lived. The Okhrana, Russia's secret police, began surveillance of Rasputin in 1910. Their reports, meticulously detailed, documented his every move. On this date, he visited a bathhouse and was seen touching 3 women inappropriately. On that date, he invited 2 women to his apartment, and they didn't leave until morning. The reports filled volumes, but they were never acted upon, because Rasputin had protection at the very top. When rumors about Rasputin's behavior reached the public, they spread like fire. Newspapers began calling him the Holy Devil. Political cartoons showed him as a puppet master, controlling the Tsar and Tsarina. Stories circulated, some true and some exaggerated, about orgies and blasphemy and corruption. The monk Iliador, who had once supported Rasputin, turned against him and published letters that revealed the extent of Rasputin's influence over Alexandra. The letters were shocking. Alexandra had written to Rasputin with disturbing intimacy. I kiss your hands, one letter read. Come soon, I need your blessing. The phrasing was innocent enough, but in the context of the conservative Russian court, any physical reference between the Tsarina and a peasant was scandalous. Rumors immediately spread that Alexandra and Rasputin were lovers, though there's no credible evidence this was true. But the damage was done. The public now saw their German-born Tsarina as under the spell of a depraved charlatan. Nicholas II refused to believe the accusations against Rasputin. He was shown the police reports, confronted by ministers and family members, begged by his own mother to banish the holy man from court. But Nicholas saw Rasputin only through Alexandra's eyes. He is a simple peasant, the Tsar said. Nothing more. The lies about him are spread by people who are jealous of his closeness to our family. This denial was partly genuine and partly political. Nicholas knew that Alexandra's mental state depended on Rasputin. She lived in constant terror for Alexei's life, and Rasputin was the only thing that calmed her. If Nicholas banned him from court, Alexandra would collapse, and Alexei might die in the next bleeding crisis without Rasputin there to ease the panic. So Nicholas protected Rasputin, even as the man's reputation destroyed the royal family's credibility. Rasputin's response to his critics was simple. They are jealous, he said. They are jealous of my closeness to the royal family. They are jealous of my power. And he was right. Much of the outrage against him came from aristocrats and ministers who resented that an illiterate peasant had more influence over the Tsar than they did. But that didn't make him innocent. The police reports were real. The eyewitness accounts were real. Rasputin was genuinely living a double life, and he felt no shame about it, whatsoever. By 1914, the scandal had grown so intense that some church officials wanted him tried for heresy. Bishop Hermogen, his former supporter, tried to force Rasputin to leave St. Petersburg. In a confrontation at the bishop's residence, Hermogen beat Rasputin with a crucifix and tried to make him swear on holy relics that he would stop his sinful behavior. Rasputin escaped and ran directly to Alexandra, who had Hermogen exiled to a remote monastery. This was the pattern. No matter what Rasputin did, Alexandra protected him. Because to her, he wasn't a drunken lecher. He was the man God sent to save her son. Everything else was lies, jealousy, attacks from enemies who wanted to destroy the monarchy. She had built an entire worldview around Rasputin's holiness, and admitting the truth would mean admitting that she had been fooled, that she had brought this man into her family, given him power, defended him against all reason. She couldn't do it, so she didn't. As Rasputin's reputation crumbled in public, his power over the royal family only grew stronger. Shadow ruler of Russia. In the summer of 1914, the world went to war. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Germany declared war on Russia. France and Britain joined the conflict. Within weeks, Europe was engulfed in the bloodiest war in human history. Russia mobilized millions of peasants and workers, sending them to the front with outdated rifles and insufficient supplies. They died by the hundreds of thousands. Nicholas II, feeling the weight of command and seeking to restore his reputation as a strong leader, made a fateful decision in September 1915. He left St. Petersburg to take personal command of the Russian army at the front. It was a symbolic gesture meant to inspire the troops, but it had catastrophic consequences. Because it left Alexandra in charge of the government, the Tsarina had no experience in governance. She was German-born, deeply unpopular with the Russian people who suspected her of sympathizing with the enemy. And she was completely dependent on one person for advice, Grigori Rasputin. What happened over the next 16 months was unprecedented in Russian history. An illiterate Siberian peasant, with no official title or position, effectively controlled the government of the largest empire on earth. He did it through whispered suggestions to Alexandra, who wrote them in letters to Nicholas at the front, who almost always followed her recommendations because he didn't want to upset her, and because he was overwhelmed by the disasters at the front. The pattern was simple and devastating. Ministers who opposed Rasputin were dismissed. Ministers who paid tribute to him were appointed. Competence became irrelevant. Loyalty to Rasputin was all that mattered. Prime Minister Ivan Goromykin was replaced by Boris Sturmer in February 1916. Sturmer was chosen specifically because Rasputin approved of him. He was a conservative bureaucrat with a German surname, which made him deeply unpopular at a time when Russia was fighting Germany. He was also incompetent, but he visited Rasputin regularly, bringing gifts and asking for blessings. And that was enough. The Minister of Internal Affairs, Alexei Kvostov, made the mistake of trying to have Rasputin assassinated. He hired agents to poison Rasputin's wine, and even considered having him kidnapped and thrown from a train. When Rasputin discovered the plot, he told Alexandra. Kvostov was immediately dismissed in March 1916. His replacement, Alexander Protopopov, was chosen because he had met with Rasputin and impressed him with his devotion. Protopopov was mentally unstable. He claimed to communicate with the ghost of Alexander III, Nicholas's father. He held seances in his office. He made bizarre decisions that accelerated the breakdown of public order, but Rasputin liked him, so he stayed in power until the very end. The pattern repeated itself across the government. The Minister of War was replaced. The Minister of Transportation was replaced. The Minister of Agriculture was replaced. Between 1915 and 1916, Russia went through 4 prime ministers, 5 ministers of internal affairs, 3 foreign ministers, 3 war ministers, and 4 ministers of agriculture. The government became paralyzed, unable to coordinate the war effort or address the growing crisis at home. Alexandra's letters to Nicholas during this period reveal the extent of Rasputin's control. She wrote to him almost daily, and the letters were filled with instructions that always began the same way. Our friend says you must do this. Our friend believes that ministers should be dismissed. Our friend thinks we should make peace with Germany. Our friend, our friend, our friend. She used the phrase hundreds of times, and Nicholas, exhausted and defeated by military disasters, usually complied. "Be firm, my darling," she wrote in one letter. "You must show them you are the autocrat. Listen to our friend. He loves you and would never guide you wrong." In another letter, she wrote, "Our friend begs you not to trust your ministers. They are all against us. You must be Peter the Great, Ivan the Terrible, Emperor Paul, crush them all under you." The tragedy was that Rasputin's political advice wasn't always wrong. He consistently advocated for Russia to make peace with Germany, which in retrospect would have saved millions of lives and might have prevented the revolution. He told Alexandra that the war was destroying Russia, that the peasants were starving, that continuing the fight would end in catastrophe. He was right, but his advice was ignored by Nicholas because making peace would have seemed like surrender, and the Tsar couldn't bear the humiliation. What Rasputin wanted most was to maintain his position and his access to the royal family. He recommended ministers not based on their competence, but based on their willingness to bribe him or flatter him or leave him alone. He had no ideology, no grand political vision. He simply wanted to preserve his power and continue his debauchery without interference. The Russian people watched this chaos with growing horror. Food shortages spread through the cities as the railway system collapsed under incompetent management. Bread prices tripled, then quadrupled. Workers went on strike, soldiers deserted from the front, and everyone blamed Rasputin. Rumors spread that he was a German spy, that he was sabotaging Russia's war effort on behalf of the Kaiser. There was no evidence for this. It was completely false. But people believed it because it was the only explanation that made sense. Why else would the government be so incompetent? Why else would Russia be losing so badly? It must be treason. It must be Rasputin. Political cartoons showed him as a puppet master, with the Tsar and Tsarina as marionettes. Jokes circulated about how to get a government position, just kiss Rasputin's hand and bring him a bottle of Madeira. Songs mocked him. Street protesters chanted his name. He had become the symbol of everything wrong, with Russia the living embodiment of the regime's corruption and incompetence. The Duma, Russia's parliament, which had limited power but represented at least some public voice, became increasingly desperate. In November 1916, a conservative member named Vladimir Purishkevich gave a speech that electrified the chamber. He stood at the podium and shouted that the Tsar's ministers had been turned into marionettes, that an evil force had taken control of Russia, that this force had a name and everyone knew it, Rasputin. The chamber erupted in applause. Even the most conservative monarchists agreed. Rasputin had to go. But how? Nicholas refused to dismiss him. Alexandra would never allow it. The only option left was murder. Russia's aristocracy realized that to save the empire, they would have to kill the man who controlled it. The assassination plot. Prince Felix Yusupov was possibly the richest man in Russia. His family owned palaces, mines, oil fields, and vast estates across the empire. He was married to Princess Irina, the Tsar's niece, which made him part of the inner circle of the imperial family. He was also bisexual, a cross-dresser who had once performed in drag in Parisian nightclubs, and a man who felt that the Romanov dynasty was collapsing because of one person, Grigori Rasputin. In December 1916, Yusupov decided to act. He gathered a small group of co-conspirators, men who shared his belief that Russia could only be saved if Rasputin died. The group included Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, a cousin of the Tsar and one of the most eligible bachelors in Russia. There was Vladimir Purishkevich, the Duma member who had given the famous speech denouncing Rasputin. There was Dr. Stanislaus Lazovert, a physician who would provide the poison. And there was Lieutenant Sergei Sukhotin, a military officer. They met in secret over several weeks, planning every detail. The challenge was that Rasputin was now under constant surveillance, partly by the secret police who were still documenting his activities, and partly by people who wanted to protect him. They needed a way to get him alone, somewhere private, where his body could be disposed of without immediate discovery. Yusupov came up with a plan. He would invite Rasputin to his palace on the Moika Canal, one of the most beautiful buildings in St. Petersburg, and he would tell Rasputin that he wanted him to meet his wife, Princess Irina. Rasputin had expressed interest in meeting her before. She was famous for her beauty, and Rasputin, who was always interested in beautiful women, would likely accept the invitation. The fact that Irina was actually in the Crimea at the time, hundreds of miles away, was irrelevant. Rasputin wouldn't know that until it was too late. They chose December 29th as the date. Yusupov visited Rasputin several times in the weeks before, building trust, playing the role of a young aristocrat, seeking spiritual guidance. Rasputin liked him. He agreed to come to the palace late at night, when they could meet privately without the press or spies watching. The conspirators prepared the basement of Yusupov's palace. They furnished it like a drawing room, with Persian carpets and bearskin rugs and a fire blazing in the hearth. On a table, they placed plates of cakes and carafes of Madeira wine. Dr. Lazavert brought potassium cyanide crystals, which he crushed into powder. They mixed the poison into the cakes, sprinkling it on top of the pink and chocolate frosting. They poured it into the wine. The amount they used, according to later accounts, was enough to kill 5 men nearly instantaneously. Everything was ready. Now they just had to wait for Rasputin to arrive. At 11 o'clock on the night of December 29th, Prince Yusupov drove his car to Rasputin's apartment building on Gorokovia Street. He went upstairs and found Rasputin in his bedroom, getting dressed. Rasputin wore his best shirt, a silk tunic embroidered with cornflowers. He had combed his hair and beard. He was putting on his new leather boots. He seemed excited, almost giddy about meeting the beautiful princess. They drove back to the palace through the freezing St. Petersburg night. Snow covered the streets. The temperature was well below zero. The city was dark, most people already asleep. When they arrived at the palace, Yusupov led Rasputin down a back staircase into the basement room. The other conspirators were upstairs, playing a gramophone loudly so Rasputin would think there was a party happening above, that the princess and her guests were still entertaining. Yusupov told Rasputin to wait, that Irina would come down soon. In the meantime, why not have some food and wine? Rasputin sat down. He looked at the cakes, he looked at the wine, and then he began to eat and drink. Yusupov watched in growing horror as Rasputin consumed 2 cakes laced with cyanide, then 3, then 4. He drank a glass of poison wine, then another, and nothing happened. Rasputin didn't clutch his throat. He didn't collapse. He didn't show any sign of distress. He just sat there, eating and drinking, commenting that the cakes were very sweet, asking when the princess would arrive. 2 hours passed. It was now past 1 in the morning. Rasputin had consumed enough poison to kill a dozen men, and he was fine. He was getting bored, asking why the party upstairs had gone quiet, wondering if he should leave. Yusupov, sweating despite the cold, excused himself and went upstairs to the other conspirators. They were panicking. "The poison isn't working," Yusupov said. "What do we do?" They debated frantically. Had Lazavert given them the wrong substance? Had the poison somehow degraded? Had they not used enough? Or was Rasputin somehow immune? None of them knew that potassium cyanide's effectiveness is drastically reduced by sugar and by stomach acid. The cakes and the wine had likely neutralized most of the poison. But they didn't know this. All they knew was that Rasputin was still alive, and they had no backup plan. Except one. Grand Duke Dmitri had brought a revolver, a Browning pistol just in case. Purishkevich also had a gun. They had hoped not to use them because gunshots were loud and would attract attention, and because shooting a man was very different from watching him die from poison. But they were out of options. Yusupov took Dmitri's revolver and went back downstairs. Rasputin was now playing Yusupov's guitar, singing a peasant song in his rough voice. He looked completely relaxed. Yusupov's hand was shaking as he held the gun behind his back. He asked Rasputin to look at a crucifix mounted on a cabinet across the room. Rasputin stood and walked over to it, his back to Yusupov. And that's when the prince raised the gun and fired. What happened next would become one of history's most terrifying murder stories. We're halfway through Rasputin's story, from Siberian mystic to shadow ruler of Russia, to the night his enemies tried to kill him. If you're captivated by this tale of the unkillable monk, hit that like button and let me know in the comments. Do you think Rasputin really had supernatural powers, or was it all manipulation? The murder attempt is about to get even more shocking. The night he wouldn't die. The The gunshot echoed through the basement at 2:30 in the morning. Rasputin fell backward, clutching his chest. Blood spread across his silk shirt. He collapsed onto the white bearskin rug, his eyes wide, gasping once, twice, and then going still. Prince Yusupov stood over him, the gun still in his hand, smoke curling from the barrel. The other conspirators rushed down the stairs. They surrounded the body. Dr. Lazavert knelt down and checked for a pulse. After a moment, he looked up and said the words they had been waiting to hear. "He's dead." They stood there for several minutes, staring at the body, the reality of what they had just done beginning to sink in. They had killed Grigori Rasputin, the mad monk, the man who controlled Russia. He was finally dead. They needed to dispose of the body quickly before dawn, before anyone noticed he was missing. But first, they needed to make sure. Yusupov told the others to go back upstairs and prepare for the next phase of the plan. He wanted a moment alone with the corpse. Perhaps he wanted to confirm for himself that it was truly over. Perhaps he wanted to feel the weight of what he had done. He knelt down next to Rasputin's body and leaned in close, studying the face, those famous eyes now closed and still. And then the left eye opened. Then the right eye opened. Rasputin's eyes stared directly into Yusupov's face, and for a frozen moment, neither of them moved. Then Rasputin's mouth opened and he screamed, a raw animal sound of rage. His hands shot up and grabbed Yusupov by the throat. "You bad boy," Rasputin snarled. "You bad boy." Yusupov later described those moments as the most terrifying of his life. Rasputin's face was contorted with fury, foam coming from his mouth, his eyes bulging. The prince tried to pull away, but Rasputin's grip was impossibly strong. The man who had just been shot in the chest and pronounced dead was now strangling him. Yusupov managed to break free and ran toward the stairs, screaming for help. Behind him, he could hear Rasputin getting to his feet. The wounded man lurched after him, crawling on his hands and knees at first, then standing, then staggering toward the stairs. Yusupov ran up into the main house, slamming the door behind him, his heart pounding so hard he thought it would burst. But Rasputin didn't follow him up the stairs. Instead, he found another route, a back door leading to the palace courtyard. He pushed it open and stumbled outside into the freezing night, leaving a trail of blood in the snow. Vladimir Purishkevich, who was in one of the upstairs rooms, heard shouting and looked out the window. In the courtyard below, lit by the palace lamps, he saw Rasputin crawling across the snow toward the front gate. The man was still alive, still moving, still trying to escape. Purishkevich grabbed his savage revolver and ran outside. The courtyard was large, surrounded by a high fence with a gate that opened onto the street. If Rasputin reached that gate and got out onto the public street, someone might see him, police might be called, the entire plot would be exposed. Purishkevich chased after him, his feet crunching in the snow. Rasputin was crawling fast, desperate, making animal sounds of pain and rage. Purishkevich raised his gun and fired. The first shot missed. The second shot missed. He was shaking too hard, the cold and the adrenaline making his aim terrible. He stopped, forced himself to breathe, and fired a third shot. This one hit Rasputin in the back. The wounded man jerked but kept crawling. Purishkevich fired a fourth shot. This one hit Rasputin in the head, in the back of the skull. Finally, Rasputin collapsed face first into the snow and stopped moving. Purishkevich walked up to the body and kicked it in the head. No response. He kicked it again, harder, still nothing. This time, he was sure. Rasputin was dead. The other conspirators came running out. They looked at the body lying in the blood-stained snow. They had shot him twice now, once in the chest and once in the head, and they had tried to poison him with enough cyanide to kill 5 men. And he had still almost escaped. They couldn't risk it happening again. Grand Duke Dmitri and Lieutenant Sukhotin began beating the body with clubs and rubber truncheons, smashing Rasputin's face and ribs until they were certain that even if some spark of life remained, he wouldn't be getting up again. Yusupov, still hysterical with fear, grabbed one of the clubs and beat the corpse as well, venting his terror and rage on the dead man who had terrified him by refusing to die. When they were finally exhausted, they wrapped Rasputin's body in a heavy blue curtain and bound it with rope. They carried it to Yusupov's car and drove through the dark, empty streets to the Petrovsky Bridge. which spanned the frozen Neva River. It was now nearly 5 in the morning. Dawn would come soon. They had to hurry. At the bridge, they dragged the wrapped corpse to a hole in the ice where the river's current had kept the water from freezing completely. They tied weights to the body, chains and heavy stones, to make sure it would sink. Then they pushed it through the hole and watched it disappear into the black water below. It was done. Rasputin was gone, drowned in the Neva River, weighed down, irretrievable. The conspirators stood on the bridge for a moment, breathing hard, watching the dark water. Then they drove back to the palace to clean up the blood, but Rasputin had left evidence behind. One of his beaver fur boots had fallen off during the struggle and was found on the riverbank the next morning by a policeman. The police began dragging the river. On December 31st, 2 days after the murder, they found the body. When they pulled it from the ice and unwrapped the blue curtain, they found Grigori Rasputin's corpse frozen solid, his arms raised above his head as if he had been trying to claw his way out from under the ice. His face was battered almost beyond recognition. There were 3 bullet wounds, one in the chest, one in the back, and one in the forehead. The autopsy was performed by Professor Dmitry Kosorotov, one of Russia's leading forensic pathologists. His conclusion was documented in the official report. The cause of death was drowning. Water was found in Rasputin's lungs, which meant his heart was still beating when he entered the river, which meant that after consuming enough poison to kill 5 men, after being shot 3 times, after being beaten with clubs, Grigori Rasputin was still alive when he hit the water. He drowned under the ice of the Neva River, alone in the freezing darkness, his lungs filling with water, finally dying after everything else had failed to kill him. This is the story that has been told for over a century. The mad monk who refused to die. The unkillable Rasputin. But the autopsy report would later be challenged. And the truth about Rasputin's death may be even stranger than the legend. The autopsy controversy. For more than a century, the story of Rasputin's death has been repeated in books, films, and documentaries. Poisoned with cyanide, shot multiple times, beaten, and drowned. The man who wouldn't die. But in recent decades, historians and forensic experts have begun questioning the official narrative, and what they have discovered suggests that much of the story was invented. The first problem is the autopsy report itself. The original document disappeared during the chaos of the Russian Revolution in 1917. Everything we think we know about the autopsy comes from secondary sources and from the accounts of the conspirators themselves, particularly Prince Felix Yusupov, who published his memoir in 1927. And Yusupov had every reason to embellish the story. The poison is where the legend begins to unravel. In all contemporary accounts from the night of the murder, in police reports and witness statements given immediately afterward, there is no mention of cyanide. The poison only appears in Yusupov's memoir, published 11 years after the fact, when most of the other participants were dead or in exile and couldn't contradict him. In 2004, Dr. Derek Pounder, a forensic scientist from the University of Dundee in Scotland, conducted a detailed analysis of the case. His conclusion was unambiguous. No poison was used. The entire story was invented by Yusupov to make the murder seem more dramatic and more justified. Dr. Pounder explained the science. Potassium cyanide is a white crystalline powder with a distinctive bitter almond smell. If you sprinkled it on top of chocolate and pink frosting, it would be visible as white crystals and the smell would be immediately noticeable. Rasputin, who may have been many things but was not stupid, would never have eaten cakes that smelled like bitter almonds and had strange white powder on them. If the poison had been baked into the cakes, the heat would have broken down the cyanide and made it less effective. If it had been mixed into the Madeira wine, the acid in the wine would have reacted with the cyanide and reduced its potency significantly. Even if some active cyanide remained, the amount needed to kill someone quickly is very large. The story that Rasputin ate multiple poisoned cakes and drank multiple glasses of poisoned wine without any effect is chemically implausible. More importantly, Dr. Lazavert, the physician who allegedly prepared the poison, gave wildly contradictory accounts over the years. In some versions he used cyanide crystals, in others he used cyanide powder. In some accounts he was terrified and shaking while preparing it. In others he was calm and methodical. His story changed depending on who was interviewing him and when. This is not how reliable testimony works. The most likely explanation is that Yusupov added the poison story years later when he was writing his memoir. Why? Because a simple shooting seemed too ordinary. Yusupov wanted to portray Rasputin as superhuman, as a dark magician who was nearly impossible to kill, because it made the murder seem more heroic. If Rasputin was a supernatural threat, then killing him was an act of salvation. But if he was just a drunk peasant who got shot in a basement, then Yusupov was simply a murderer. The gunshots, however, were real. 3 bullets were found in Rasputin's body. 1 entered the left side of his chest, 1 entered his back, 1 entered his forehead at point-blank range, leaving powder burns on the skin. This 3rd shot, the one to the forehead, is particularly interesting because of what it reveals about the actual murder. The chest wound was likely the first shot, fired by Yusupov. This wound would have been serious but not immediately fatal, especially if the bullet missed the heart. The back wound was likely the 3rd shot fired by Purishkevich in the courtyard. This also would have been serious but not immediately fatal. But the forehead wound was the kill shot. It was fired from directly in front of Rasputin's face, close enough that gunpowder residue was embedded in his skin. And here's where the story gets complicated. Both Yusupov and Purishkevich used Browning revolvers, which fired 7.65mm bullets. But according to some historians, the bullet that killed Rasputin was a .455 caliber round, which would have come from a British Webley revolver. This discrepancy has led to one of the most controversial theories about Rasputin's death. In 2004, British historian Andrew Cook published a book claiming that a British Secret Service agent delivered the final kill shot. The agent's name was Oswald Rayner, and he was a friend of Prince Yusupov from their days together at Oxford University. Rayner was in St. Petersburg in December 1916, working for the British Intelligence Service. Cook's theory is that the British wanted Rasputin dead because he was advocating for Russia to make a separate peace with Germany, which would have freed up millions of German troops to fight on the Western Front against Britain and France. A separate peace would have been catastrophic for the Allies. So, British intelligence, according to Cook, sent Rayner to ensure that the assassination succeeded. The evidence is circumstantial. Rayner was in St. Petersburg. He did know Yusupov. He did work for British intelligence. And there are reports that a foreigner was present at the palace that night, though this was never officially confirmed. The different caliber bullet is the strongest piece of evidence. But even this is disputed because the original autopsy report is lost, and we're relying on second-hand accounts of what it said. Most mainstream historians are skeptical of the British involvement theory. They point out that Rayner never mentioned it in any of his letters or papers, that Yusupov never mentioned a British agent being present, and that the conspiracy would have required an extraordinary level of secrecy that seems implausible. But the theory persists because it fits the shadowy nature of the entire affair. What about the drowning? Did Rasputin really survive all the gunshots only to drown under the ice? This is perhaps the most debated aspect of the entire story. Professor Kozarotov's autopsy allegedly found water in Rasputin's lungs, which would indicate that he was breathing when he entered the river. But modern pathologists point out that water can enter the lungs post-mortem, especially if a body is submerged for several days in freezing water. As ice forms and melts around the corpse, water can be drawn into the airways through purely mechanical processes. The image of Rasputin's frozen corpse with arms raised above his head, as if he was trying to claw out from under the ice, has been cited as proof that he was alive and conscious when he drowned. But forensic experts explain that this position, called a pugilistic pose, is common in bodies that have been in cold water or that have experienced rigor mortis in certain positions. It doesn't necessarily indicate that the person was conscious or struggling. The most likely scenario, based on modern forensic analysis, is that Rasputin was shot 3 times, with the final shot to his forehead rendering him unconscious or killing him almost instantly. His body was then thrown into the river while he was either already dead or dying. The water in his lungs could have come from agonal breathing, the final reflexive gasps of a dying person, or from post-mortem infiltration. He wasn't clawing at the ice trying to escape. He was already gone. But this version of events is far less dramatic than the legend. And that's why the legend has persisted. Yusupov needed Rasputin to be unkillable to justify the elaborate murder plot, and to make himself look like a hero rather than a killer. Russian people needed Rasputin to be supernatural to explain how an illiterate peasant had gained so much power over their empire. The story of the mad monk who refused to die was more satisfying, more meaningful, more memorable than the truth. So, the legend grew. Books and films repeated Yusupov's version of events without questioning it. Each retelling added new details, new embellishments. Rasputin became immortal in death, transformed from a man into a myth, his actual life and death buried under layers of propaganda and imagination. Whether Rasputin was unkillable or simply unlucky, his death came too late to save the empire he helped destroy. The fall of the Romanovs. On January 1, 1917, 3 days after the murder, Grigori Rasputin was buried in a secret ceremony at Tsarskoye Selo, the royal family's estate outside St. Petersburg. Only the imperial family and a few trusted servants attended. Tsarina Alexandra placed an icon on his chest and a letter in his hand, a final message of gratitude to the man she believed God had sent to save her son. She wept openly. Nicholas II stood beside her, grim and silent, knowing that the murder of Rasputin was a symbol of something larger, a sign that his authority was collapsing. The conspirators were dealt with swiftly but gently. Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich was exiled to the Persian front, a punishment that probably saved his life since he was out of the country when the revolution came. Prince Felix Yusupov was confined to one of his family estates, a mild sentence that reflected Nicholas's unwillingness to harshly punish members of the aristocracy, even when they had committed murder. Vladimir Purishkevich faced no punishment at all. He was a member of the Duma, and Nicholas didn't dare make a martyr of him. The Russian public celebrated Rasputin's death. Crowds gathered in the streets of Petrograd. The city's wartime name after St. Petersburg was deemed too German-sounding. People cheered, they sang, they drank toasts to the men who had killed the mad monk. Finally, they thought, the curse is lifted. Finally, Russia can recover. They were wrong. Rasputin's death changed nothing. The damage was already done. Before his murder, Rasputin had allegedly written a letter to Alexandra. The authenticity of this letter has never been proven, and many historians believe it was forged after his death. But it became famous nonetheless because it seemed to predict the future with eerie accuracy. The letter read, "If I am killed by common assassins, you have nothing to fear. Your children will rule Russia for hundreds of years. But if I am murdered by nobles, by aristocrats, by members of your own family, then their hands will remain soiled with my blood for 25 years. They will leave Russia, brothers will kill brothers. The Russian land will be drenched in blood. If your relatives carry out my murder, then no one in your family will remain alive for more than 2 years. You will all be killed by the Russian people." 8 weeks after Rasputin's death, revolution came. In late February 1917, which was early March by the modern calendar, protests erupted in Petrograd. They began as demonstrations about bread shortages. Women stood in lines for hours in freezing temperatures, waiting to buy bread that often never came. Factories were closing because there was no coal to run the machinery. The railway system was collapsing. Soldiers were deserting from the front, tired of dying for a war they didn't understand. The government, paralyzed by years of incompetent ministers appointed through Rasputin's influence, could do nothing. The protests grew. Workers joined the women, students joined the workers. Within days, hundreds of thousands of people filled the streets. They carried signs demanding bread and peace. They sang revolutionary songs. And when the Tsar ordered troops to fire on the crowds, the troops refused. Some of them joined the protesters instead. On March 15, 1917, Nicholas II abdicated the throne. He did it quietly, signing a document in his railway car while trying to return to Petrograd from the front. He abdicated not only for himself, but also for his son, Alexei, whose hemophilia made him too fragile to rule. The crown passed briefly to Nicholas's brother, Grand Duke Michael, who refused it. After 300 years, the Romanov dynasty ended. A provisional government took power, led by liberal politicians who promised democracy and continued war against Germany. Nicholas and his family were placed under house arrest at their palace, treated relatively well at first, almost like honored guests rather than prisoners. Alexandra spent her days caring for Alexei, who was sick again, bleeding internally, with no Rasputin to call upon. The boy suffered terribly. In March 1917, revolutionary soldiers went to Rasputin's grave at Tsarskoye Selo. They dug up his coffin, pried it open, and pulled out his corpse. It had been in the ground for less than 3 months and was partially preserved by the winter cold. They loaded the body onto a truck and drove it to a forest outside Petrograd. There, they built a pyre, soaked it with gasoline, and burned Rasputin's corpse. Alexandra's icon burned with him, his ashes scattered in the wind. No grave remains, no memorial, nothing. The provisional government proved weak and ineffective. They kept Russia in the war despite massive casualties and growing unrest. They couldn't solve the food crisis or the economic collapse. In November 1917, the Bolsheviks, a radical communist faction led by Vladimir Lenin, seized power in a nearly bloodless coup. Russia became the Soviet Union. The provisional government fled or was arrested, and the royal family situation became much more dangerous. The Bolsheviks moved Nicholas, Alexandra, and their 5 children to Yekaterinburg, a city in the Ural Mountains, far from Petrograd. They were imprisoned in a house that had been requisitioned from a local merchant. The windows were painted over. Guards watched them constantly. They were allowed outside for only 1 hour per day. Their meals became smaller and smaller. The guards grew increasingly hostile, making crude jokes about the former Tsarina, spitting in their food. By July 1918, the Russian Civil War was intensifying. The anti-Bolshevik White Army was advancing toward Yekaterinburg. The Bolsheviks feared that if the Whites captured the city, they would rescue the royal family and use them as symbols to rally opposition to the communist government. Lenin and other Bolshevik leaders decided there was only one solution. On the night of July 17, 1918, the royal family was woken up just after midnight. They were told to dress and come downstairs to the basement because there were disturbances in the city and they needed to be moved to a safer location. Nicholas carried Alexei, who was too weak to walk. Alexandra held her youngest daughter Anastasia's hand. The family gathered in a small room in the basement, along with their doctor, their cook, and 2 servants who had remained loyal to them. They waited, not knowing what was about to happen. Then a squad of Bolshevik soldiers entered the room. Their commander, Yakov Yurovsky, read a brief statement. "The Ural Soviet of Workers has decided to execute you." Nicholas had time to say only, "What?" before the shooting began. The soldiers fired at point-blank range. Nicholas died first, shot in the head. Alexandra tried to make the sign of the cross, but was killed before she could finish. The children screamed. The soldiers kept firing. The room filled with smoke and the deafening sound of gunfire. When the shooting finally stopped, some of the family members were still alive, moaning in the smoke. The soldiers used bayonets to finish them. The entire family was dead. Nicholas, Alexandra, Alexei, and all 4 of their daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia. The doctor, the cook, and the servants were also killed. 11 people murdered in total. The bodies were taken to a forest outside the city. The Bolsheviks tried to destroy them, using sulfuric acid and fire, then buried what remained in a shallow grave. The location was kept secret for decades. It wasn't until 1991, after the fall of the Soviet Union, that the grave was discovered and the remains were identified through DNA testing. Rasputin's alleged prophecy had come true, at least in the broad strokes. The nobles who killed him had left Russia, fled into exile across Europe. Brothers had killed brothers. The Russian Civil War would claim millions of lives. And the entire Romanov family had been executed 18 months after Rasputin's death. Whether the letter was real or forged, it seemed to have predicted the future with chilling accuracy. But did Rasputin cause the Russian Revolution? Historians have debated this question for over a century. The consensus is no, but with important qualifications. Russia was already on the path to revolution before Rasputin appeared. The government was corrupt and inefficient. The Tsar was weak and indecisive. The gap between the wealthy aristocracy and the impoverished peasants was unsustainable. World War I accelerated the collapse by exposing every weakness in the Russian system. But Rasputin made everything worse. His influence over Alexandra led to catastrophic ministerial appointments that paralyzed the government precisely when competent leadership was most needed. His personal scandals delegitimized the monarchy in the eyes of the public, making Nicholas and Alexandra seem weak and superstitious rather than strong and dignified. He became the symbol of everything wrong with the old regime, the living embodiment of corruption and decay. Historian Orlando Figes, one of the leading scholars of the Russian Revolution, put it this way: Rasputin didn't destroy Russia, but he symbolized everything wrong with the old regime. He was the symptom, not the disease, but symptoms can be fatal if left untreated. The Romanov dynasty fell because it couldn't adapt to the modern world, because it clung to absolute monarchy when the country needed reform, because it fought a disastrous war it couldn't win, and because at the crucial moment when leadership mattered most, the Tsarina was taking advice from an illiterate Siberian peasant who thought sin was the path to salvation. Grigori Rasputin was one man. He didn't command armies or write laws or lead revolutions, but he whispered in a desperate mother's ear, and those whispers echoed through palaces and government ministries and battlefields until they brought down an empire. Who was Rasputin really? A holy man? A charlatan? Or something far more complex? The real Rasputin. For over a century, Grigori Rasputin has been portrayed as a monster, a demon, a dark magician who corrupted the Russian Empire through supernatural powers and sexual depravity. But the real Rasputin, the actual man beneath the legend, was far more complicated than either his defenders or his enemies wanted to admit. To understand who he truly was, we need to separate the myth from the reality, examining each aspect of his life with clear eyes. His healing powers are where the mystery begins. Did Rasputin actually have the ability to heal the Tsarevich Alexei, or was it all psychological manipulation? The modern medical consensus is clear. Rasputin almost certainly did help Alexei, but not through supernatural means. The mechanism was likely a combination of factors that we can now explain scientifically. Hemophilia is a condition where blood doesn't clot properly, and stress makes it worse. When a hemophiliac is stressed or anxious, blood pressure rises, which can exacerbate bleeding. When Alexei had a bleeding crisis, the royal doctors would panic. Alexandra would panic. Everyone around the boy would be in a state of terror. This collective anxiety fed into Alexei's own fear, creating a feedback loop that made his condition worse. Rasputin's approach was the opposite. He would arrive calm, confident, radiating certainty that the boy would survive. He would tell Alexandra to stop worrying, that God had everything under control. He would speak to Alexei in a gentle, hypnotic voice, praying for hours in his rhythmic peasant dialect. His very presence changed the atmosphere in the room from panic to peace. More importantly, Rasputin probably stopped the doctors from administering their treatments. The physicians of that era used aspirin to reduce fever and pain, but aspirin is a blood thinner. Giving aspirin to a hemophiliac is one of the worst things you can do. They also used tight bandages and pressure, which increased pain and stress without helping the bleeding. Rasputin's instruction to Alexandra, "Do not allow the doctors to bother him too much," was probably the most medically sound advice anyone gave. Modern doctors who have studied the case agree that Rasputin's methods, whether he understood them scientifically or not, were effective. Historian Douglas Smith, who spent years researching Rasputin's life, concluded that he was effective but not supernatural. Alexandra's faith in him was actually rational, given the consistent results. Every time Rasputin intervened, Alexei improved. From her perspective, he was the only person who could save her son. But what about his sexual behavior? Here the evidence is damning, but also more nuanced than the sensational stories suggest. Police surveillance reports from the Okhrana, Russia's secret police, confirmed that Rasputin engaged in numerous affairs, frequented bathhouses, groped women in public, and hosted gatherings in his apartment that often turned sexual. These reports are detailed, dated, and corroborated by multiple sources. They're not propaganda, they're documentation. However, many of the most extreme accusations were exaggerated or coerced. Some women who gave testimony against Rasputin later admitted they had been pressured by police to embellish their stories. The Okhrana had a political interest in discrediting Rasputin because they knew his influence over the royal family was destabilizing the government. So, while the core facts are true, Rasputin was genuinely promiscuous and often inappropriate, the worst stories about him engaging in massive orgies or practicing black magic were likely inventions. What's important to understand, is that Rasputin didn't see his sexual behavior as hypocritical. To him, it was entirely consistent with his religious beliefs. The Kalisti sect genuinely taught that sin was a path to spiritual enlightenment. You had to exhaust your capacity for sin in order to transcend it. Sexual union was viewed as a form of rejoicing, a way to experience divine ecstasy. Rasputin believed this absolutely. He wasn't pretending to be holy while secretly being corrupt. He thought sex and holiness were compatible, even connected. Historian Joseph Foreman, who studied Rasputin's religious philosophy extensively, described him as a libertine, but not the monster he was portrayed to be. He was a man who believed in his own interpretation of Christianity, however unorthodox, and lived according to those beliefs. The fact that his beliefs conveniently justified his desires doesn't make him unique in human history. Most people find ways to rationalize what they want to do. His political influence is perhaps the most debated aspect of his legacy. How much power did Rasputin actually have? The answer is real power, but only for a limited time, primarily between 1915 and 1916, a period of about 18 months. Before that, he was influential in the royal family, but had little direct impact on government. After late 1916, his influence was waning, as even Alexandra began to question some of his recommendations. During his period of maximum power, Rasputin did successfully advocate for the appointment and dismissal of several ministers. But examining these appointments in detail reveals a complex picture. The ministers he recommended were generally incompetent, but they weren't traitors or German spies as rumored. Most of them were conservative bureaucrats who appealed to Rasputin because they promised to leave him alone or because they gave him gifts and money. Some were genuinely interested in peace with Germany, which aligned with Rasputin's consistent anti-war position. And here's something rarely mentioned in accounts of Rasputin's political role. His advice was often actually sensible. He repeatedly urged Nicholas to end the war, arguing that it was destroying Russia and killing millions of peasants for no good reason. He was right. He told Alexandra that the people needed food and land reform, more than they needed military glory. He was right. He warned that continuing the war would lead to revolution and disaster. He was right about that too. The problem wasn't that Rasputin gave bad advice. The problem was that Alexandra filtered his practical suggestions through her own paranoia and desperation, and that Nicholas either ignored the advice or was too weak to implement it effectively. The other problem was that Rasputin's personal corruption and the ministers he recommended were genuinely damaging. A leader can be right about the big picture and still cause harm through his methods. What was his actual personality like? This is difficult to reconstruct, because most accounts come from people who either worshipped him or hated him. But some patterns emerge from the more reliable sources. Rasputin was genuinely charismatic. Even his enemies admitted this. When he entered a room, people noticed. His eyes were mesmerizing, his voice was compelling, and he had a quality that made people want to tell him their secrets. This wasn't supernatural. Some people simply have magnetic personalities, and Rasputin had this in abundance. He was intelligent despite his lack of formal education. He couldn't write well, and his spelling was atrocious, but he understood people. He knew how to read a room, how to sense what someone wanted to hear, how to make himself indispensable. He was also shrewd enough to protect his position through careful manipulation of Alexandra's emotions. He never pushed too hard. He never demanded official titles or positions. He stayed in the shadows, which made him harder to attack directly. He was manipulative, absolutely. He used people's desperation and faith to gain power over them. He told aristocratic women that they were beautiful and holy, and that sleeping with him would bring them closer to God. He told Alexandra that only he could save her son, creating a dependency that gave him leverage over the most powerful woman in Russia. These are the actions of a manipulator, but he also seems to have genuinely believed in his own mission. His daughter Maria, who wrote a memoir about her father after his death, described him as kind and playful at home. He loved his children. He sent money back to his wife in Siberia regularly. Even after he became wealthy and powerful, he played with peasant children when he visited his home village. He wasn't purely cynical. He believed he had been chosen by God to help people, and he seems to have loved the attention and power that came with that role. He drank heavily, but accounts of him being constantly drunk are exaggerated. Many of the police surveillance reports note that he was sober during important meetings. The drunken behavior happened mostly at night, in restaurants and bathhouses, when he was relaxing or performing his public role as the wild holy man. It was almost theatrical, a persona he put on. The complexity of Rasputin's character is what makes him endlessly fascinating. He wasn't purely evil or purely holy. He was a peasant who genuinely helped a sick child, and then exploited that access for personal gain. He was a mystic who believed his own legend and then used it to seduce women and manipulate aristocrats. He was a product of his time and place, emerging from a Russia that was deeply superstitious, deeply unequal, and deeply broken. Historian Edvard Radzinski, who wrote one of the most comprehensive biographies of Rasputin, concluded that he was a mirror held up to Russia's decay. The country was sick, corrupt, desperate for something to believe in. Rasputin appeared at exactly the right moment to fill that need. If he hadn't existed, someone like him would have emerged anyway because the system created the space for someone like him to thrive. The real tragedy is that Rasputin had the potential to be a positive force. If he had genuinely been a holy man committed to helping others, if he had used his influence over Alexandra to push for peace and reform without corruption, if he had been the person Alexandra believed he was, he might have actually helped prevent the revolution. But he was human, flawed, driven by ego and desire as much as by any spiritual mission. And in the end, those flaws contributed to the destruction of the empire he had infiltrated. Grigori Rasputin was not a demon. He was a man, a complicated, contradictory, charismatic, manipulative, possibly well-meaning, definitely corrupt man who found himself at the center of one of history's greatest catastrophes. Understanding him as a human being, rather than as a monster or a saint, is the only way to truly understand the role he played in the fall of the Romanov dynasty. But Rasputin's legacy extends far beyond the Russian Revolution. His shadow still haunts us today. The eternal Rasputin, Grigori Rasputin, has been dead for over a century, his body burned to ash and scattered in a Russian forest in 1917. But in the realm of culture and imagination, he has never been more alive. He has appeared in more than 100 films. His face has been on album covers, in video games, in comic books, in television series. His name has become shorthand for a particular kind of sinister influence, used to describe political advisors and shadowy figures in governments around the world. The mad monk who wouldn't die has achieved a kind of immortality that few historical figures ever reach. The first films about Rasputin appeared while he was still alive, German propaganda films during World War I that portrayed him as a demonic figure corrupting the Russian court. After his death, the flood of Rasputin films began in earnest. Silent films in the 1920s, Hollywood productions in the 1930s, Russian films, German films, American films, British films. Each generation has remade Rasputin in its own image, emphasizing different aspects of his story, depending on what resonated with contemporary audiences. In the 1930s and 40s, he was portrayed as a mad hypnotist, reflecting the era's fascination with psychology and mind control. In the 1960s and 70s, he became a sexual libertine, fitting the period's preoccupation with breaking taboos. In recent decades, he's been portrayed with more complexity, sometimes as a tragic figure, sometimes as a shrewd manipulator, sometimes as both. The most famous modern cultural representation of Rasputin is probably the 1978 disco song by the German group Boney M. Rasputin, lover of the Russian queen, the song goes, with its infectious beat and historically questionable lyrics. The song has been streamed hundreds of millions of times, introducing Rasputin to generations who might never otherwise have heard of him. Russia's greatest love machine, the song declares, turning a complicated historical figure into a cartoonish villain and seducer. But why does Rasputin endure? What is it about this one person, among the millions who lived and died in that era, that captures our imagination so completely? Part of it is the outsider narrative. Rasputin was a peasant who conquered an empire, an illiterate nobody who gained power over the most exclusive social circle in the world. This is a universal fantasy. The idea that charisma and will can overcome any social barrier. In a world still defined by class and privilege, Rasputin's story suggests that anything is possible, that one person from nowhere can change everything. Part of it is the combination of sex and power. Rasputin wasn't just powerful, He was scandalously sexual. He embodied forbidden desires, transgressed every social norm, and suffered no consequences until the very end. In cultures that are still uncomfortable with sexuality, that still separate the spiritual from the physical, Rasputin represents the fantasy of integration, of being able to indulge every appetite without shame or punishment. The fact that he eventually paid for his transgressions with his life only completes the morality tale, giving his story a satisfying arc. Part of it is the unkillable myth, the story of the man who survived poison, bullets, beating, and finally drowned under the ice, is one of the most memorable murder stories in history. It suggests that Rasputin was more than human, that he had tapped into some supernatural power that made him nearly impossible to kill. Even though modern forensic analysis has debunked much of the legend, people don't want to let it go. The truth is less interesting than the myth, so the myth persists. Part of it is that Rasputin was a historical pivot point. His death occurred just weeks before the Russian Revolution, which led to the creation of the Soviet Union, which shaped the entire 20th century through world wars and Cold War and the nuclear age. When we look back at the sweep of history, Rasputin appears at a crucial moment, a moment when one path ended and another began. It's tempting to see him as a cause rather than a symptom, as the linchpin whose removal should have saved Russia, but instead accelerated its collapse. And part of it is simply those eyes. The famous photograph of Rasputin, with his intense hypnotic stare, his wild beard, his peasant clothing, is one of the most recognizable images in history. Those eyes seem to look through the camera, through time, directly at the viewer. They're unsettling, magnetic, impossible to forget. That single image has done more to cement Rasputin's legend than any book or film could. In the modern world, Rasputin's name has become a political weapon. Advisors and consultants who wield disproportionate influence behind the scenes are routinely called Rasputin figures. In America, Steve Bannon was called Trump's Rasputin. In Britain, Dominic Cummings was called Boris Johnson's Rasputin. In Russia, Vladislav Surkov, a longtime advisor to Vladimir Putin, has been called Putin's Rasputin. The comparison is always meant as an insult, suggesting someone who manipulates a leader through charisma rather than competence, who operates in shadows rather than in public, who exercises power without accountability. The parallel isn't always fair. Most of these figures don't share Rasputin's personal vices or his mystical pretensions, but the archetype is powerful because it taps into a fundamental anxiety about how power actually works. We want to believe that leaders make their own decisions based on rational analysis. The existence of a Rasputin figure suggests instead that leaders are manipulated, that the real power lies with someone we can't see or hold accountable, that the government is controlled by whispers rather than by votes or laws. In Russia today, there's been a curious rehabilitation of Rasputin's image. During the Soviet era, he was portrayed as a symbol of everything wrong with the old regime, a corrupt monk who hastened the revolution. But in Putin's Russia, which has sought to reconnect with pre-revolutionary history and rehabilitate the Orthodox Church, some voices have emerged defending Rasputin as a patriot who opposed the war with Germany and who was slandered by his enemies. In 2016, the centennial of Rasputin's assassination, Russian officials refused to commemorate the event. Bishop Tikhon Shevkunov, a powerful figure in the Russian Orthodox Church and reportedly close to Putin, called Rasputin, a devout Orthodox Christian who was slandered by enemies of Russia. This revisionism is politically motivated, part of a broader effort to create a narrative of Russian history that emphasizes continuity rather than rupture. That presents the Soviet period as an aberration, rather than as the inevitable result of Tsarist failures. Rasputin's descendants, who live in Paris, have consistently rejected the Mad Monk label. His great-granddaughter, Lawrence Hewitt Soloviev, has given interviews defending him. He was a healer, not a devil, she has said. The stories about him were lies spread by aristocrats who hated him because he was a peasant. While family members defending their ancestor is understandable, it's worth noting that the documentary evidence, the police reports, and the eyewitness testimony paints a more complicated picture than either the demonization or the rehabilitation suggests. What does Rasputin reveal about power? Perhaps this is his most enduring legacy, the lessons his story teaches about how influence actually operates. First, Proximity to power is often more dangerous than power itself. Rasputin never held an official position, never commanded troops or signed laws. But his proximity to Alexandra, who had proximity to Nicholas, who held absolute power, gave him more influence than most government ministers. He operated in the gaps of the system, in the informal relationships that official structures don't account for. Second, desperate people will believe anyone who offers hope. Alexandra wasn't stupid or naive. She was a mother watching her son suffer, knowing that he would probably die young, living in constant terror. When Rasputin offered relief from that terror, she believed him because she needed to believe him. This dynamic plays out constantly in human affairs. People facing illness, poverty, fear, uncertainty. They're vulnerable to anyone who promises salvation. Rasputin understood this instinctively and exploited it masterfully. Third, charisma without accountability leads to corruption. Rasputin had no formal position, which meant he couldn't be fired or impeached or voted out. He operated entirely through personal relationships, which made him nearly impossible to remove through official channels. The only way to get rid of him was to kill him, and even that required a conspiracy involving members of the royal family. Any system that allows individuals to wield power without accountability will eventually produce Rasputin figures. Fourth, when institutions fail, charlatans thrive. Rasputin succeeded because Russia's government was dysfunctional. Its church was disconnected from the people. Its society was fractured by inequality. In a healthy system with strong institutions and social trust, someone like Rasputin would have been marginalized quickly. But in a sick system, he filled a void. He provided something that legitimate institutions couldn't or wouldn't provide: a sense of connection, of meaning, of hope. Finally, the line between holy man and con artist depends entirely on perspective. To Alexandra, Rasputin was a saint sent by God. To his critics, he was a fraud and a predator. Both perspectives had evidence to support them. Rasputin helped Alexei, but he also exploited that help for personal gain. He genuinely believed in his spiritual mission, but he also enjoyed wealth, power, and sexual conquests. The truth is that he was both things simultaneously, and maybe that's true of more leaders and influencers than we'd like to admit. Was Rasputin evil, or was he simply a product of a dying empire? These questions don't have simple answers because Rasputin himself wasn't simple. He was capable of kindness and cruelty, faith and manipulation, healing and harm. He emerged from a specific historical moment, when Russia was caught between tradition and modernity, when the old certainties were collapsing but nothing new had taken their place. Did he destroy the Romanovs? No. They were already destroying themselves through political rigidity, military incompetence, and refusal to reform. Rasputin accelerated the process, but he didn't cause it. Historian Simon Sebag Montefiore, who has written extensively about Russian history, put it perfectly. Rasputin was the symptom, not the disease. Russia was already collapsing. He just made the collapse more dramatic, more visible, more personal. The legacy of Grigori Rasputin is this: 5 people conspired to kill one man, planning for weeks, using poison and bullets and clubs and drowning. That man had already killed an empire, not with armies or revolution, but with whispers in a desperate mother's ear. Rasputin proved that in the right moment, in the right place, one person, no matter how unlikely, can change the course of history. He was an illiterate peasant from Siberia who should have died unknown in the village where he was born. Instead, his name echoes through the decades, his face stares out from history books and movie screens. His story is told and retold in every generation. He has become immortal in the only way that matters, through memory, through myth, through the endless human fascination with power and corruption and the thin line between the sacred and the profane. Grigori Rasputin died in the frozen Neva River on December 30th, 1916. But the mad monk who refused to die has lived on for over a century in our nightmares, our fascinations, and our warnings about the dangers of unchecked influence. From Siberian peasant to shadow ruler of Russia to the man who wouldn't die, Rasputin's story is one of history's most chilling tales of power, manipulation, and mystery. We've traced his path from the icy villages of Siberia to the glittering palaces of St. Petersburg, from the bedside of a dying prince to the basement where he was murdered, from the myths that surround him to the complicated reality beneath. If this deep dive into the Mad Monk's true story kept you company through the night, subscribe to The Deep Unknown for more dark characters who shaped history. Hit the like button if you appreciate the research that went into separating Rasputin's legend from reality. And here's a question for the comments. Do you think Rasputin genuinely had healing powers, or was it all psychological manipulation? Your insights often inspire future documentaries, and I read every single comment. Until next time, sleep well, and remember that the most dangerous people in history aren't always the ones holding the weapons.